Well, Johnny Cash had his big break in 1954. He walked into Sam Phillips Sun Records in Memphis, Tennessee. Phillips was just starting out, and he had already signed a young Elvis Presley to his label. Johnny Cash would be his number 2 star, and later he signed Jerry Lee Lewis and Roy Orbison. So a great start for this fledgling young company. I Walk the Line was Johnny's earliest recording. He recorded it in 1956. And when Phillips first heard Johnny play this song, he didn't like the tempo of the song. Johnny originally wrote this as kind of a slow ballad, but Phillips wanted him to do a more up-tempo version. So after they recorded the song, he asked Johnny, he said, "Would you just, for the fun of it, humor me and do a more upbeat version of this song?" And Johnny was a little reluctant to do it, but he humored him and he did it. So they recorded the up-tempo version of the song. Well, Cash was a little bit shocked when a little bit later he heard "I Walk the Line" on the radio. And guess what? It was the upbeat version of the song. Phillips had rather sneakily released the up version tempo of the song without saying anything to Johnny, but Johnny couldn't argue too much or object too much because the song had become an immediate hit. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the song, but it was inspired by Vivian Cash, Johnny's wife, and she was worried that her husband would not be faithful to her while he was traveling all the time on the road. And so Cash wrote this song to reassure her of his love for her. And so really, "I Walk the Line" is a song of love and fidelity. And some of you may not be familiar with it, so let's take a look at it. The words are following. He says, "I keep a close watch on this heart of mine. I keep my eyes wide open all the time. I keep the ends out for the tie that binds. Because you're mine, I walk the line. I find it very, very easy to be true. I find myself alone when each day is through. Yes, I'll admit that I'm a fool for you. Because you're mine, I walk the line. As sure as night is dark and day is light, I keep you on my mind both day and night. And happiness I've known proves that it's right. Because you're mine, I walk the line." I think many of you know how Johnny's marriage ended up. Although his intentions were good at the start as he wrote this song, he did end up divorcing his wife. The relationship went a little bit sour. And when you look at the relationship between Johnny and his wife, it actually has some resemblances to God's relationship with his bride, Israel, in the Old Testament. In fact, if you were to relook at the words of this song and imagine it being a song that Israel wrote to God, it actually kind of fits and has and is kind of neat. Let's actually back up one. We didn't do this first service. Let's just go back to the previous. "I find it very easy to be true. I find myself alone when each day is through, not worshiping other gods. Yes, I admit that I'm a fool for you because you're mine. I will be your God, you will be my people. Because you're mine, I will walk the line. And as sure as night is dark and day is night, I keep you on my mind both day and night. And happiness I've known proves that it's right. Because you're mine, I walk the line." Kind of fits, doesn't it? The relationship between God and Israel when that relationship first started way back at the beginning of Israel, but we know that relationship didn't last long either, and Israel was unfaithful. So God, in our reading today, speaks to them about a different line, not about walking the line, but rather he speaks of a plumb line. So I guess our topic today is on lines. Amos chapter 7 said, "This is what he showed me. Behold, the Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line, with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. Then the Lord said, well, behold, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people, Israel. So as we just discussed, Israel's in a covenant with God. I will be your God. You will be my people. Obey my commandments. And the biggest of these commandments was to worship no other gods. Well, they failed miserably. So God sent prophets to them to wake them up and to tell them what they're doing wrong. And Amos happened to be the latest prophet that we had in our reading today. And so God gives Amos a vision. And in this vision, there is this wall. And that wall is to represent Israel. Okay? And then with this wall, there is a plumb line. Now, there's some debate about what the Hebrew word actually means. The most common interpretation is that it's plumb line, and that's what we'll go with. And God's point with his vision, well, the point is that the wall, Israel, is warped. It's not straight and true. And they definitely were not walking the line. Now, the plumb line in this image actually represents the law. And that's what it means when it says this wall was built with a plumb line. That's saying this nation, Israel, was built with the plumb line of the law as its foundation. Okay, it indicates this holy nation was built around the law. And that happened back at Sinai when they received the Ten Commandments. And so this community, as God had God's law as its founding document, and they were called to live up to this document. But they weren't. And now they are warped, not straight, not true. We could say it's a little bit analogous to Martin Luther King Jr., who had to call this nation to live up to its founding document that talked about all men being created equal. And of course, we know how Martin Luther was accepted when he first began that message. So the people of God are not measuring up to the founding document. So Amos tells them there will be some judgment. The high places of Isaac shall be made desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste, and I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. Jennifer and I at times have been involved in some home improvement projects. We have actually done wallpapering together, and our marriage has survived. Of course, that uses, if any of you have ever done it, that uses a plumb line to make sure that your wallpaper is actually straight. And we did so well with that, we got more adventuresome, and more recently we decided we were going to tile the floor in our hallway. This was going to be a bit of a challenge. Not only was it a challenge, I mean, we could have taken a very simple pattern like in the upper left there, but no. We have to do a complex pattern on our very first attempt. And so it was actually something closer to the lower picture, but it was even worse. Even those small squares, if you were to take each of those small squares and divide that up into 4 smaller squares, that was the pattern that we tried to lay on our very first attempt. And I don't know if you noticed, but there's an awful lot of lines to keep track of. And it was actually very overwhelming to keep track of all these lines and to keep them all straight. Well, it's interesting. We all pay attention to different things. I initially started laying the tile, and I was worried about the big picture, making sure the lines went straight. But then if there was a little tile that got a little out and I had to adjust, it wasn't any big deal. Well, Jennifer, that bugged her. The spaces between the tiles have to be exact, otherwise she's gonna see it. So I says, okay, well, I'll let you tile then. So she started tiling, And I had the saw out in the garage, so I was cutting the pieces and bringing them in. And she did really well. You could look, and you couldn't find any detectable difference. The spaces all looked the same as you went down the hall. But when we got done and you looked and you stood back in a bird's eye view, we had a little bit of a duck hook at the end of the hallway, about a half of an inch over. And so we both had mistakes that we were looking at. And the point is sometimes there just are so many lines to keep track of that you just can't do it. Unless you're obviously very experienced. And we could ask the question, was that the case for Israel? Did they have so many lines, so many laws that they had to keep track of, that it was just when they broke the law, it was just, oops, there were just so many of them, I lost track and I couldn't keep record of it? Well, that was not the case for Israel. Rather, there was a very monumental problem with Israel and their laws, and that issue was pride. Because Israel at the time was a kingdom living with unprecedented wealth and power and prestige, and they had all the comforts of life. And they worked hard for them, and they earned them. And so why did they need God? We live that way today too. We have many blessings. Many of them we've worked hard for. And so we deserve them. And because in our eyes we earned them, there is a misplaced sense of power. And yes, we all crave power. We might not call ourselves big shots, but we would probably all say that we call the shots in our lives. But this story we read today is about misplaced power. In fact, it's about idolatry of human power. And God came to shake them up. We can see the idolatry of their power when we take a closer look at Amaziah. He was the priest of the day. He was the priest in power. And as we discussed a few weeks ago or last week about the church and the state were pretty closely linked. And so Amaziah was close to the king. And so this priest who was in charge, Amaziah, he seeks to undercut this prophetic message. He knew